the woman with twisted hands. That was what the people of Barron County called her. And what genetics did to 3 generations in Appalachia would become one of the most disturbing cases of family isolation ever documented in American history. In the autumn of 1962, a young public health nurse named Dorothy Callahan drove her government-issued Ford pickup along a road that seemed to dissolve into the mountains of eastern Kentucky. She had been assigned to conduct routine vaccination rounds in the remote hollows of Appalachia, places where modern medicine had yet to penetrate the thick veil of poverty and geographic isolation. What she would discover in a place called Sycamore Hollow would haunt her for the rest of her life. The road narrowed until it was little more than a muddy path carved between ancient oak trees. Dorothy had been warned about the Combs family by her supervisor and Hazard. They keep to themselves, he had told her with a strange look in his eyes. Been up in that hollow since before the Civil War, don't expect a warm welcome. What he had not told her, what perhaps he could not bring himself to say, was the truth about why the Combs family had remained so isolated for so many generations. Dorothy parked her truck where the road ended and continued on foot. The October air was crisp, carrying the scent of decaying leaves and wood smoke. After walking nearly a mile through increasingly dense forest, she emerged into a small clearing where several weathered wooden structures stood in various states of disrepair. The main house, if it could be called that, was a 2-story cabin with a sagging porch and windows covered with oiled paper instead of glass. Chickens scratched in the dirt yard and a thin plume of smoke rose from a stone chimney. But it was not the poverty that made Dorothy stop in her tracks. It was the figure sitting on the porch. A woman who appeared to be in her 40s sat in a rocking chair, though Dorothy would later learn she was only 28 years old. Her hands rested in her lap, and even from a distance Dorothy could see that something was terribly wrong with them. The fingers were twisted at unnatural angles, bent backward in some places and fused together in others. The woman's face bore features that seemed somehow compressed, with eyes set too close together and a forehead that sloped backward at an unusual angle. The woman's name was Bessie Mae Combs, and she was, in the complex terminology of Appalachian kinship, both the daughter and the granddaughter of the same man. The story of the Combs family begins in 1847, when a man named Ezekiel Combs first settled in Sycamore Hollow. He had come from Virginia, fleeing rumors and accusations that had made life impossible in his home county. Ezekiel was a large man with a violent temper and a particular set of beliefs about bloodlines and family purity that he had inherited from his own father. He brought with him his wife Martha and their 3 children. Within a decade, Martha had given him 7 more offspring. But the hollow was remote, nearly inaccessible for most of the year, and the nearest neighbors lived more than 15 miles away over treacherous mountain terrain. When Ezekiel's oldest daughter, Sarah, reached the age of 15 in 1858, he made a decision that would echo through generations. Rather than allow her to marry outside the family, rather than risk diluting what he called the pure Combs blood, he arranged for her to become the wife of her own brother, Thomas. The practice was not unknown in the most isolated parts of Appalachia during this era. Geographic isolation, poverty, and deeply ingrained beliefs about family loyalty created conditions where such unions could occur without outside interference. There were no roads leading to Sycamore Hollow. There were no census takers who ventured that far into the mountains. There was no one to witness or report what was happening in that remote clearing. Sarah and Thomas produced 6 children between 1859 and 1871. Of those 6, only 3 survived past infancy. The other 3 died of what Ezekiel recorded in the family Bible as weakness of constitution. Though modern understanding would recognize the signs of severe genetic abnormalities incompatible with life. The 3 surviving children, 2 boys and a girl, all showed signs of what their family called the Combs marks. Shortened fingers, unusual facial features, difficulty with speech and comprehension, but they were alive, and in the harsh calculus of survival in post-Civil War Appalachia, that was enough. The pattern continued. Ezekiel's grandchildren married each other. Then his great-grandchildren did the same. By the time Dorothy Callahan arrived in 1962, 5 generations of Combs had lived and reproduced within the confines of Sycamore Hollow, with virtually no genetic contribution from the outside world. The effects were devastating and cumulative. Each generation showed more pronounced abnormalities than the last. Hands that had been merely shortened in the 2nd generation became twisted and fused by the 4th. Mild intellectual difficulties became profound cognitive impairment. Simple cleft palates evolved into severe facial malformations. Bessie Mae Combs, the woman Dorothy encountered on that October day, represented the 5th generation of this closed genetic line. Her twisted hands were the result of a condition now known as symphalangism combined with ectrodactyly, conditions caused by recessive genes that had accumulated through generations of consanguineous unions. Her parents had been first cousins whose parents had themselves been siblings. Dorothy approached the porch slowly, her medical bag clutched in front of her like a shield. She introduced herself and explained her purpose. She was there to offer vaccinations, she said. Polio, measles, diseases that were ravaging communities throughout Appalachia. Bessie May regarded her with pale blue eyes that seemed to look through her rather than at her. She did not speak. Instead, she turned her head toward the door of the cabin and made a sound, a kind of wordless call that was answered moments later by the appearance of another figure. This was Harlan Combs, Bessie May's brother, and as Dorothy would eventually learn, also her husband. He was a tall man with a pronounced curvature of the spine and hands that, while not as severely affected as his sisters, showed clear signs of the same genetic conditions. His speech was difficult to understand, a combination of the regional dialect and what appeared to be a physical impediment affecting his jaw and tongue. Harlan was initially suspicious of the outsider, but Dorothy had been trained to work with reluctant communities. She spoke softly, made no sudden movements, and offered small gifts she had brought for exactly this purpose. Bags of sugar, cans of coffee, a bolt of fabric. Slowly, over the course of several hours, she gained enough trust to be invited inside. What she found in that cabin would form the basis of a report that would eventually reach the desks of public health officials in Frankfurt and ultimately researchers at the University of Kentucky who were studying the effects of genetic isolation in Appalachian communities. There were 14 people living in the Combs compound in 1962. All of them shared the distinctive features that marked them as products of generations of close family unions. Some were more severely affected than others. The youngest children, belonging to the sixth generation, showed abnormalities so pronounced that Dorothy initially did not recognize them as human children at all. One boy, approximately 4 years old, had a cranial structure so malformed that his head appeared almost triangular in shape. His eyes bulged from their sockets and his mouth could not fully close due to the misalignment of his jaw. He could not walk or speak, and he spent his days lying on a pallet near the fire, making sounds that his family seemed to understand but that were incomprehensible to Dorothy. Another child, a girl of perhaps 7, had been born without fully formed legs. Her limbs ended at the knees in rounded stumps, and she moved around the cabin by dragging herself with her arms, which were themselves shortened and twisted. Despite her physical condition, she appeared more mentally alert than some of her relatives, and she watched Dorothy with an intelligence that the nurse found both heartbreaking and disturbing. Dorothy stayed in Sycamore Hollow for 3 days, administering what vaccines she could and documenting what she observed. She learned, through patient questioning and careful observation, the full extent of the Combs family's history. She learned about the generations of unions between siblings and between parents and children. She learned about the babies who had not survived, buried in a small cemetery behind the cabin where tiny unmarked graves outnumbered the larger ones. She also learned about the family's fierce resistance to the outside world. They had lived this way for over a century. They knew no other way, and they had developed an elaborate system of beliefs that justified their practices. A twisted interpretation of biblical texts that convinced them they were preserving something pure and holy rather than destroying their own genetic legacy. When Dorothy finally left Sycamore Hollow, she carried with her a burden of knowledge that would change the course of her career and lead to one of the first systematic studies of consanguinity in isolated American communities. But the story of the Combs family was far from over. In fact, the most disturbing chapters were yet to be written. Check if you are subscribed to this channel. These are the stories that history tried to bury, and you deserve to know every hidden truth. The report Dorothy Callahan filed with the Kentucky State Health Department in November of 1962 set in motion a chain of events that would bring the outside world crashing into Sycamore Hollow for the first time in over a century. Dr. Harold Mendelsohn, a geneticist at the University of Kentucky, read Dorothy's report with growing horror and fascination. He had spent years studying the effects of genetic isolation in various communities, but he had never encountered anything as extreme as what the nurse described. Here was a family that had essentially conducted a multi-generational experiment in human genetics, with themselves as both the subjects and the victims. In the spring of 1963, Dr. Mendelsohn organized an expedition to Sycamore Hollow. He brought with him 2 other physicians, a photographer, and a social worker. What they documented over the course of a week would become the foundation of a landmark study on the genetic consequences of prolonged consanguinity. The medical team found that every member of the Combs family displayed multiple congenital abnormalities. The most common were the hand deformities that had given Bessie May her local nickname, but these were far from the only issues. Nearly all family members showed some degree of intellectual impairment. Many had hearing loss. Several had heart defects that had gone undiagnosed and untreated for years. 2 of the older adults appeared to be suffering from early-onset dementia, though they were only in their 40s. Dr. Mendelsohn took careful notes and collected blood samples from every family member who would consent, which, after much persuasion, was most of them. In an era before sophisticated genetic testing, his analysis was necessarily limited. But even the basic blood typing he could perform revealed patterns consistent with extreme inbreeding. But it was the stories the family told that proved most valuable to understanding what had happened in Sycamore Hollow. Over the course of that week, Dr. Mendelsohn pieced together a genealogy that read like a horror novel. The family patriarch in 1963 was a man named Jeremiah Combs, who was 73 years old and the grandson of the original settler Ezekiel. Jeremiah had been married twice, first to his own sister, who had died in childbirth in 1918, and then to his niece, the daughter of another sister. This second union had produced Bessie May and Harlan, among others. Jeremiah himself was the product of a union between siblings, and his parents had been the children of Ezekiel and 2 of Ezekiel's own daughters by his original wife, Martha. The family tree did not branch outward like a normal genealogy. Instead, it folded in on itself, creating loops and connections that seemed almost impossible to follow. Dr. Mendelsohn calculated that by the 5th generation, the average Combs family member shared more genetic material with their relatives than identical twins typically share. They were, in genetic terms, almost clones of each other. Their gene pool so restricted that the natural variation that protects most populations from hereditary diseases had been almost entirely eliminated. The consequences were written on their bodies. Recessive genes that would normally remain hidden, carried by individuals but never expressed, had found their matches generation after generation. Diseases that affect 1 in 10,000 people in the general population affected 1 in 3 in Sycamore Hollow. Conditions that medical textbooks described as rare had become the norm. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the Combs family situation was not biological, but psychological. They did not see themselves as victims. They saw themselves as chosen. Jeremiah Combs spoke to Dr. Mendelsohn at length about the family beliefs that had sustained their isolation for over a century. He quoted scripture, though his interpretations bore little resemblance to mainstream Christianity. He spoke of purity of blood and the sin of mixing with outsiders. He spoke of the Combs line as special, marked by God, destined for something greater than ordinary humanity. The deformities and disabilities that plagued his family were not, in his view, punishments or consequences. They were marks of divine favor, signs that the family was being transformed into something new. The children who died, and there had been so many who died, were sacrifices necessary for this transformation. Those who survived were the elect, the chosen ones who would inherit a spiritual kingdom. This belief system, passed down through generations along with defective genes, had made the Combs family resistant to any suggestion that their practices were harmful. When Dr. Mendelsohn carefully explained the genetic basis for their health problems, when he showed them diagrams and photographs from medical textbooks, Jeremiah simply smiled and shook his head. "You don't understand," he said in his difficult-to-follow speech. "We are becoming what we are meant to become. The Lord works in mysterious ways." Dr. Mendelsohn's visit had one immediate consequence. He recommended, and the state agreed, that the most severely affected children should be removed from the hollow and placed in institutional care. This was standard practice in 1963 for children with severe disabilities, and the Combs children certainly qualified. But when social workers arrived to implement this recommendation, they found the family had vanished. Someone had warned them, perhaps someone in town who had learned of the government's interest, and the entire clan had disappeared deeper into the mountains. For 3 years, the Combs family lived as fugitives in the wilderness, moving from hollow to hollow, always staying one step ahead of the authorities. During this period of flight, the family's situation deteriorated further. Cut off from even the limited resources they had accessed before, several of the most vulnerable members died. The 4-year-old boy Dorothy had observed, the one with the severely malformed skull, died in the winter of 1964. 2 elderly family members died the following year. A baby born during the flight survived only a few hours. By 1966, the survivors were desperate enough to accept help when it was offered. A local minister named Reverend Thomas Whitaker had been following the family's story and believed he could help them. Unlike the doctors and social workers who had approached the family before, Reverend Whitaker came with no agenda of removal or separation. He simply wanted to provide food, clothing, and medical care. Through patient outreach, he eventually convinced the remaining Combs family members to return to Sycamore Hollow. He promised them that no one would take their children away, a promise he was not entirely authorized to make, but which he kept through sheer force of will and political maneuvering. The family that returned to the Hollow in 1966 was smaller and more broken than the one that had fled. Jeremiah had died during the flight, leaving Harlan as the new patriarch. Bessie May had lost 2 of her children. The surviving members were weakened, traumatized, and more suspicious of outsiders than ever, but they were not finished. The patterns that had governed their lives for over a century continued. Bessie May was once again carrying her brother-husband's child. Other unions were forming among the younger generation. The genetic catastrophe that was the Combs family was preparing to claim another generation of victims. And in the outside world, the story of Sycamore Hollow was beginning to spread. Newspaper reporters had gotten hold of Dr. Mendelssohn's study. Sensationalized accounts appeared in magazines and tabloids. The woman with twisted hands became a figure of morbid fascination. Her image, taken without consent by the medical photographers, appearing in publications across the country. The Combs family had wanted only to be left alone. Instead, they were becoming famous. Their tragedy transformed into entertainment for a public hungry for stories of the strange and forbidden. The child was born on a cold February night in 1967. Bessie May labored for 18 hours in the same cabin where she herself had been born, attended only by her mother-in-law and an elderly aunt. There was no doctor, no midwife from outside the family. The Combs did not trust outsiders with their most intimate moments, especially not after the events of the previous years. When the baby finally emerged, there was a long moment of silence. Then the aunt began to keen, a high-pitched wailing sound that echoed through the hollow and brought the other family members running to the cabin. The baby was alive, but barely. It was a girl, though determining this required careful examination due to the severity of her physical abnormalities. Her limbs were present but drastically shortened, giving her a truncated appearance. Her face was compressed in a way that made breathing difficult. Her eyes, when they opened, were milky white, sightless. They named her Sarah, after the first Combs woman to engage in the practice that had led to this moment. It was meant as an honor, a connection to the family heritage. In reality, it was a cruel irony, naming this suffering child after the woman whose forced union had set this tragedy in motion over a century earlier. Baby Sarah lived for 3 months. During that time, she never once saw the world she had been born into. She never heard her mother's voice clearly due to profound deafness. She experienced existence only as a series of physical sensations, most of them painful. When she finally died, slipping away in her sleep on a May morning when the dogwoods were blooming outside the cabin. Her passing was recorded in the family Bible with the same terse notation that had marked so many other infant deaths. Gone to God. But baby Sarah was not the only child born to the Combs family in the late 1960s, despite everything that had happened. Despite the medical warnings and the public exposure and the deaths, the family continued its practices. Between 1966 and 1972, 7 more children were born in Sycamore Hollow. Of those 7, 3 survived past their first birthday. Of those 3, 2 showed severe disabilities. The outside world had not forgotten about the Combs family. Reverend Whitaker continued his ministry to them, bringing supplies and providing a link to the broader community. Occasionally, journalists or researchers would make the trek to the Hollow, seeking interviews or photographs. Most were turned away, but some managed to document the ongoing tragedy. A photographer named William Gedney visited Sycamore Hollow in 1968 as part of a project documenting poverty in Appalachia. His photographs, taken with the family's grudging permission, provided a stark visual record of their conditions. Bessie May appears in several images, her twisted hands folded in her lap. Her prematurely aged face staring at the camera with an expression that seems to combine defiance, exhaustion, and something that might be despair. Harlan appears as well, standing in front of the family cabin with a shotgun cradled in his arms. His posture is protective, defensive. The message is clear. This far and no further. Whatever you think you know about us, whatever you think you have the right to do, we will resist. But resistance was becoming harder. The children who survived were growing up, and they were beginning to ask questions that their parents could not answer. Why did they look different from the people they occasionally saw in town? Why did their bodies work in ways that seemed wrong, painful, limiting? Why did so many of their siblings die? One of these questioning children was a boy named Ezekiel, named for the founder of the family line. Born in 1968, Ezekiel showed fewer physical abnormalities than many of his relatives. His hands were normal, his face unremarkable. His intelligence appeared to be within normal ranges. He was, in genetic terms, something of a miracle, a child who had somehow escaped the worst consequences of his heritage. But Ezekiel was also different in another way. He was curious about the outside world in a way that his family found threatening. He asked about the cars he heard on the distant road. He asked about the airplanes that sometimes flew overhead. He asked about the books that Reverend Whitaker brought, books that he taught himself to read despite having no formal education. By the time Ezekiel was 10 years old in 1978, he had become a source of conflict within the family. Harlan saw his son's curiosity as a betrayal, a rejection of everything the Combs stood for. Bessie May was more sympathetic, perhaps recognizing in her son a desire for escape that she herself had never been able to acknowledge. The conflict came to a head one summer evening when Ezekiel announced that he wanted to leave Sycamore Hollow. He wanted to go to school, a real school. He wanted to learn about the world. He wanted to become something other than what his family had made him. Harlan beat his son that night, the first and only time he had ever raised a hand to any of his children. The violence was not severe by the standards of the era and the region, but it represented a breaking point. The next morning, Ezekiel was gone. He had walked out of the hollow in the darkness, following the old path to the road, and then continued walking until he reached the town of Jackson, nearly 20 miles away. If this story has touched something deep within you, if you feel the weight of these hidden truths, leave a comment saying, "Some secrets should never stay buried." Let me know you understand. Ezekiel Combs never returned to Sycamore Hollow. He was taken in by a family in Jackson, enrolled in school, and eventually graduated from high school with honors. He went on to community college and then to the University of Kentucky, where he earned a degree in social work. He spent his career helping other families trapped in cycles of poverty and isolation, though he never publicly spoke about his own origins. But Ezekiel's escape did not end the tragedy of the Combs family. In fact, his departure marked the beginning of the end. Without Ezekiel, the family lost its brightest and most capable member. The practical tasks he had performed, the thinking and planning that had kept the family functioning, now fell to people less able to handle them. The family's already precarious situation began to deteriorate more rapidly. Harlan, devastated by what he saw as his son's betrayal, withdrew into himself. He spent his days sitting on the porch, staring at nothing, speaking to no one. Bessie May tried to hold things together, but her twisted hands made even simple tasks difficult, and her own health was failing. The younger children, those who had survived, were too affected by their genetic heritage to take on adult responsibilities. By the early 1980s, the Combs family was dying, not through any single dramatic event, but through the slow accumulation of neglect, malnutrition, and untreated medical conditions. One by one, the remaining members succumbed. Harlan died in 1982 of what was probably a heart attack, though no official cause of death was ever recorded. Bessie May's mother died the same year. Two of the youngest children died in 1983, their exact causes of death unknown. By 1985, only Bessie May and two of her surviving children remained in Sycamore Hollow. They were the last of the Combs line, the final products of over a century of genetic isolation. The experiment that Ezekiel Combs had begun in 1847 was finally reaching its conclusion. In the autumn of 1985, a social worker named Patricia Hendricks made the journey to Sycamore Hollow. She had been assigned to check on the remaining Combs family members after concerns were raised by Reverend Whitaker, now elderly himself, but still committed to his ministry to the family. What Patricia found when she arrived was a scene of profound desolation. The cabin that had once housed over a dozen people now contained only 3. Bessie May, at 51 years old, looked like a woman of 80. Her twisted hands were now almost entirely non-functional, the joints frozen by arthritis. She could barely walk, her spine having curved so severely over the years that she was bent almost double. With her were 2 of her children, a son named Harlan Jr., who was 22 but functioned at the level of a young child, and a daughter named Martha, who was 18 and, like her uncle Ezekiel before her, had escaped the worst of the family's genetic curse. Martha Combs would become the key to understanding what had happened to her family and the key to ensuring that their story would not be forgotten. Unlike most of her relatives, Martha had been born with relatively few physical abnormalities. Her hands were normal, her face unremarkable. She had some hearing loss and mild cognitive